Here's the death toll that never makes it into the survival content. Not the gunfight, not the starvation, not the exposure. The dysentery outbreak that moved through a survival group of 12 people in 72 hours and left 4 of them dead within a week. The cholera that appeared in the water supply 3 weeks into a displacement scenario and killed indiscriminately across age and physical fitness. The wound infection that started as a minor laceration developed into sepsis and killed someone who had survived everything the collapse had thrown at them for 2 months because basic sanitation around wound care wasn't maintained. In every documented mass survival event in modern history, every post-earthquake displacement, every siege, every refugee crisis, every disaster-isolated community that had to function without infrastructure for weeks or months, the leading cause of death was not violence. It was infectious disease produced by sanitation failure. The pattern is so consistent across so many different events and so many different cultures and climates that it functions as a law. When sanitation infrastructure fails, disease follows, and disease kills at a rate that no other collapse threat matches at scale. The survival community focuses almost entirely on the threats that look dramatic: raiders, starvation, exposure, conflict. These threats are real. They also account for a minority of collapse deaths when the event extends beyond the acute phase. The majority come from the quiet, invisible, unglamorous failure of the systems that manage human waste, contamination, and microbial transmission. Here are the 5 sanitation failures that kill more people than violence after a collapse, what each one produces physiologically, and the specific protocols that prevent each one from operating. Failure 1. Unmanaged human waste contaminating the water and food supply. Human feces contains pathogens in concentrations that make it one of the most dangerous substances in any survival environment. Cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, rotavirus, cryptosporidium, giardia. Each is transmitted through the fecal-oral route, the pathway by which pathogens from feces reach the mouth through contaminated water, contaminated food, or contaminated hands. Each causes gastrointestinal illness, ranging from debilitating to fatal. And in a population that is already nutritionally depleted, immunocompromised from stress, and without access to medical care, which describes the collapse survivor population, precisely each of them kills people that a healthy, well-nourished population would survive. The failure mechanism is straightforward and completely preventable. Human waste is deposited near water sources, or too shallowly in soil to prevent leaching into groundwater, or in locations that allow surface runoff to carry it into water collection areas. Flies contact the waste and then contact food preparation surfaces. Hands that handled waste contact food without adequate cleaning. The protocol is the pit latrine, positioned and maintained with specific standards. Latrine position must be a minimum of 30 meters from any water source and downhill from it. Groundwater moves downhill, and a latrine uphill from your water source is a slow-moving contamination event. Depth must be sufficient to prevent fly access to fresh waste, a minimum of 1 meter. The latrine site is covered after each use to prevent fly access, and the approach to the latrine has a hand-washing station, ash and water where soap isn't available. Ash being a surprisingly effective hand-cleaning agent due to its alkalinity used before the user handles food or water. None of this is complicated. All of it requires deliberate establishment before the group starts producing waste at the location, because retrofitting sanitation after contamination has begun is significantly harder than building it correctly from the start. Failure 2. Hand contamination transmitting pathogens from person to person. Hands are the primary vector for pathogen transmission in any close contact group environment, not the air, not surface contact. Hands, which touch faces, food, shared surfaces, and each other, constantly carry pathogens from source to destination with an efficiency that makes them the most important transmission route to control. In the collapse environment, the conditions that maximize hand contamination are all present simultaneously. Multiple people sharing limited space and surfaces. Wound care conducted by people who then handle food. Sick individuals in close proximity to healthy ones. No running water, no soap, and no automatic behavioral cues. No soap dispensers, no hand-washing reminders to trigger the hygiene behaviors most people perform automatically in normal life. The specific failure mode is behavioral, not knowledge-based. Most people know they should wash their hands. They don't consistently in a collapse environment because the friction is higher than when a sink with soap was immediately available. And the consequences are delayed illness, appears days later, by which time the transmission event has been repeated dozens of times. The protocol addresses behavioral friction directly. Hand-washing stations are positioned at specific high-contamination transition points at the latrine exit before food preparation, after wound care, after handling any potentially contaminated item, rather than at general-purpose areas requiring deliberate detour. The protocol is written as a group norm, with explicit accountability rather than an individual recommendation, because social enforcement of hygiene norms is significantly more effective than individual motivation alone. The group that treats hand hand washing as a collective protocol rather than a personal preference maintains a transmission barrier worth more than most medical interventions available in a collapse environment. Failure 3. Wound contamination from inadequate cleaning and dressing protocols. The wound is an open interface between the interior of the body and the exterior environment. In a normal environment with managed microbial load, this interface heals before contamination can establish. In a collapse environment where the person is in contact with soil, debris, untreated water, and the general microbial environment of a resource-scarce survival situation, every open wound is a contamination event in progress. The specific failure is not dramatic wound infection visibly red, warm, swollen, and obviously progressing. It is quiet contamination that doesn't produce immediate, obvious symptoms, but establishes a chronic low-grade infection that depletes immune resources, slows healing, and creates a pathway for systemic infection when the immune system's capacity to contain it is reduced by any other stressor. Minor wounds, abrasions, small lacerations, punctures are almost universally undertreated in collapse scenarios because they don't look serious. They receive a brief cleaning and a covering, and the person moves on. The covering isn't changed on schedule. The wound isn't monitored. 3 days later, what was a minor abrasion is a moderate infection. 2 weeks later, it's significant, and the person whose immune system was already running at a deficit has added a sustained infection to the load. Every wound is flushed with the cleanest available water, immediately not wiped, flushed with enough volume to mechanically clear debris. The wound is covered with the cleanest available material. The covering is changed every 24 hours at minimum, with assessment at every change, increasing redness beyond the wound edge, warmth, swelling, pain that is increasing rather than decreasing, any discharge that is not clear and minimal. Any of these signs escalates the treatment protocol. The person with the most wound care knowledge is designated as wound management responsible. The person whose role includes monitoring all active wounds in the group, not just responding when someone reports a problem. Wounds get worse quiet. The monitoring function catches them before quiet progression becomes a crisis. Failure 4. Food contamination from inadequate preparation and storage hygiene. Food in a collapse environment is obtained from sources that introduce contamination pathways that don't exist in commercial supply chains. The trapped animal carries its own microbial load, including pathogens in the gut and on the hide that transfer to meat during field dressing. Foraged plant material has been in contact with soil, insects, and potentially animal waste. Scavenged commercial food, stored under non-ideal conditions, may have begun pathogen growth not visible or detectably odorous at levels that still cause significant illness. Food contamination illness follows the same amplification pattern. As waterborne illness, one sick person compromises the group's collective operational capacity and may transmit to others before the source is identified. In a group of 6 people, 2 simultaneously ill reduces operational capacity by 33% during the illness period and more during recovery when reduced capacity and increased caloric need converge. All meat is cooked to internal temperatures that destroy surface and shallow penetrating pathogens. The visual cue is no pink tissue remaining, not merely no blood, and not merely external browning. Food preparation surfaces, hands, cutting implements, containers are cleaned between handling raw animal products and handling food consumed without further cooking. Cooked food is not left at ambient temperature for extended periods before consumption because the temperature range between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit is the optimal growth range for most foodborne pathogens. Any commercial food in damaged packaging, swollen cans, compromised seals, visible mold is not consumed regardless of scarcity. The caloric value of a contaminated food item is negative when the illness it produces reduces caloric absorption and productive capacity for the following week. Failure 5. Sick individual management that allows preventable transmission through the group. The final sanitation failure is the most socially difficult to implement and the most operationally critical. The protocol for managing sick individuals to prevent transmission to healthy members. The failure mode is understandable and lethal. A sick group member is a person who needs care, who is frightened and in discomfort, and who is part of a group with established social bonds. The natural impulse is integration, keeping them close, providing comfort, maintaining group cohesion. This impulse is humane. It is also, in a group operating in a high transmission environment without medical infrastructure, an efficient mechanism for spreading whatever the sick person has to every healthy person. Respiratory illness is the most significant transmission risk. A person with a respiratory infection exhaling in a small, poorly ventilated shared space is continuously aerosolizing pathogens into the air every other person is breathing. Distance and ventilation are the primary barriers, and both are compromised in the typical collapse shelter where people are crowded into small spaces for warmth. Gastrointestinal illness transmission through shared surfaces, food preparation areas, and water containers operates on an even shorter timeline. The sick individual protocol is established before it is needed because establishing it while someone is already ill requires requires navigating emotional and social difficulty simultaneously with managing the medical emergency. The protocol specifies a designated sick area separated from food preparation, water storage, and primary sleeping areas, with its own air circulation where possible. It specifies care roles, who provides care, how they manage their own protection, what hand hygiene they maintain between sick area and healthy area. It specifies placement criteria onset of any gastrointestinal or respiratory symptoms before severity is established. And it specifies return criteria symptom resolution for 48 hours minimum. The group that has established this protocol before illness appears implements it with significantly less emotional difficulty than the group that has to establish it in the moment. The protocol is the norm. The norm was agreed to when everyone was healthy. Implementing it when someone gets sick is following the plan, not abandoning the sick person. Here is the frame for all five. Sanitation in a collapse environment is not a comfort consideration. It is the primary mortality management system available to a group that has no medical infrastructure, no pharmaceutical supply chain, and no institutional response capacity. Every sanitation protocol in this list is a direct substitute for a medical intervention that is no longer available, and most of them are more effective as prevention than the medical interventions would have been as treatment. The pit latrine correctly positioned prevents cholera from reaching the water supply. The hand-washing protocol maintained consistently prevents fecal-oral transmission between group members. The wound care protocol applied rigorously prevents minor injuries from becoming sepsis. The food preparation protocol applied consistently prevents foodborne illness from cycling through the group. The sick individual protocol implemented without sentiment prevents one respiratory illness from becoming a group-wide event at the worst possible time. None of these are complicated. None require equipment that can't be improvised. All of them require deliberate establishment, explicit group commitment, and consistent maintenance as operational norms rather than individual choices. The groups that survive long-term collapses are not the most heavily armed. They are not the best stocked. Historically and consistently, they are the groups with the best sanitation discipline, the ones who understood that in the absence of antibiotics, prevention of infection is worth immeasurably more than any attempt to treat it. Build the sanitation infrastructure first, before you're sick, before the contamination pathway has already operated, before the outbreak is already in progress, because the outbreak that has already started is significantly harder to contain than the one that never began. Human waste management is not the glamorous part of survival preparation. It is the part that determines whether most of the other preparation was for anything.